People perceive and understand color emotionally and psychologically. But how do we parameterize color? How do human eyes physically see? And how do computers reproduce what we see? Conceptually, red, blue, and yellow are thought of as the primary colors. While this is how people historically think about color, in reality, if you wanted to mix paints to create more colors, the specific shades of red and blue that you would need are magenta and cyan. This is the case for mixing paint. But when we're talking about light bulbs, projectors, and computer monitors, we aren't mixing paints, we're mixing light. Designing for screens is a bit different than designing for the physical world. One example of this is that printed content is easy to look at on a white background. But on a screen, a white background can be harder on the eyes than a darker background. If we're talking about mixing light rather than paint, we actually need a different set of primary colors: red, green, and blue, often referred to in shorthand as RGB. Most computer software and image formats describe their colors in RGB. Images that have transparency, like PNGs, have a fourth channel that represents how opaque a pixel is, called alpha. In shorthand, the collection of 4 values is RGBA. Screens and projectors use combinations of red, green, and blue to create the variety of colors that they display. Colors will look slightly different on different hardware depending on the exact technology used to display the colors, the age of the monitor or the bulbs, and other factors. So it's beneficial to preview your visualization on a few different screens to get an idea for the range of color that your audience will actually see. But how do we see color anyway? Our vision depends on light. Light that we get from the sun or a blank screen can appear to be white, but it's actually a combination of many different wavelengths, where each color is a specific wavelength. The light that humans can see is actually a very small portion of all the possible wavelengths that are emitted by different types of sources. When a light ray leaves a light source and hits an object, part of it gets absorbed and part of it gets reflected. This object appears yellow because it's absorbed every color except for yellow, and the yellow wavelength is what's being bounced off of it. The light ray that hits this object is scattered in many directions. You see the rays that scatter in the direction of your eyes. The human eye is a complex system made of cells found nowhere else in the body. At a high level, we can see because our eye has 2 kinds of receptors, called cones and rods. Cones are most active in daylight, and they're responsible for our ability to process color. There are 3 types of cones in human eyes, which are most sensitive to blue, green, and red wavelengths. A yellow wavelength will excite both our red and green cones, so our brain interprets the color as somewhere in between. Color blindness is usually a deficiency in one of these types of cones, not all of them, which is why colorblind people still see some color, not just black and white. About 5% of the population is colorblind, so it's a good idea to use visual indicators other than just hue to differentiate between features in your visualizations. Rods are the second type of receptor in our eyes. Rods aren't sensitive to color, but they're sensitive to contrast between light and dark objects. They're more active than cones in the dark, and they help us not stub our toes or run into things in the middle of the night. We have about 100 million rods as compared to just 5 million cones in each eye, so we perceive brightness much better than color. We're also able to perceive depth, not due to any special receptors, but due to the fact that we have 2 eyes, which see the world from 2 slightly different perspectives. We can hack this with stereoscopic 3D techniques, which allow each of your eyes to see a slightly different image. These are a hack because they change where your eyes are focusing, but not where they're pointing. It's interesting to note that about 10% of the population is depth blind, so you shouldn't rely on stereo vision in the same way that you shouldn't rely on color vision in your audience. But we sense depth in a lot of other ways too, like by the accumulation of fog or other particles in the air. If you change your viewpoint, the rate that things closer to you appear to move is faster than the rate that things farther away move. This effect is called parallax. We can also tell depth by the relative sizes of objects. When looking at this picture, we don't assume that these are tiny elephants because they appear small in the photo. We know that they're probably about the same size as the elephants in the front, but they're smaller because they're more distant. It's easy to take advantage of visual cues like this to trick the eye with optical illusions. This room creates the illusion that a person changes in size depending on where they're standing. In reality, the room is built so that it looks normal from a certain angle, but it's actually shaped in a strange way that plays with your depth perception. It's possible to accidentally create optical illusions in your visualizations through the choices you make in your design process, so it's important to be aware of a few of them. People aren't very good at judging the size of objects in comparison to one another. These orange circles are the same size, but the one on the right appears larger than the one on the left. The apparent brightness of an object can change depending on its surroundings. It's often a good idea to use more than one visual cue if it's important that an audience is able to compare the differences between and within the variables that you're visualizing. Physical cameras were designed to mimic the human eye. The lens on a camera works like the lens of your eye. It takes in light from the surrounding world and focuses it to a single point behind the lens called the focal point. The distance between the lens and the focal point is the focal length. You can change the focal length of your eye by flexing it to focus on something close to you, and relaxing it to look at something far away. Your eye flexes to change its curvature and therefore its focus. Cell phone cameras have a fixed focal length, but you can change lenses on your camera or use a zoom lens to change the focal length of a camera like this. Changing the focal length changes the amount of the world that you can see at any given time. This is described as the horizontal and vertical field of view. You have to be careful when choosing your field of view because it can warp your image. You can do this intentionally for a dramatic effect, but that may not be desirable for a data visualization. The camera's aperture refers to the size of the opening of the camera shutter. This is similar to the iris of your eye. A bigger opening allows for more light to come in. This affects the exposure of your image, and together with focal length, affects the depth of field as well. Depth of field refers to how fuzzy the background of your image is. This effect can be used to focus a viewer's attention on something, or to suggest the size of an object or the depth of a scene. Virtual cameras are based on physical cameras and have many of the same settings, though the effects are created digitally rather than through actual lenses or shutters. But you can still digitally control focal length, aperture, field of view, depth of field, and other settings. Virtual cameras can do additional things that physical cameras can't do, like change the projection of a scene. In real life, our eyes and our cameras see the world around us with a perspective projection. This means that all lines that are parallel in the real world appear to converge at some single distant point. But our virtual world doesn't have to follow the rules of the physical world. There are many other types of projection, but you may find an orthographic projection especially useful. An orthographic projection means that objects don't get smaller and lines don't converge the farther you look into the distance. This can actually be very handy for debugging your visualizations or for accurately measuring distances, since you can physically take a ruler and measure objects in your image and you know they won't change size depending on distance. For the most part, virtual cameras are based on analog cameras, which are in turn based on our eyes. Understanding how images are created at each of these levels can help you demystify confusing visual errors and make intentional choices optimized for human vision. Have you ever wondered if the colors you see are different from the colors somebody else sees? There's some evidence to suggest that some very small number of people, mostly women, have a genetic mutation called tetrachromacy, which gives them a fourth type of cone and allows them to see even more depth of color. Furthermore, a lot of animals see wavelengths of light that we can't see. The mantis shrimp has 16 types of cones. Dogs only have 2, so they see fewer colors than we do. Butterflies and reindeer see ultraviolet light. Certain snakes, fish, frogs, and blood-sucking insects can see infrared. There's a lot of world out there that we're not seeing.